All right, we're jumping right in today to take apart a really famous and frankly really flawed psychological theory that came out right after World War II. It was an attempt to explain one of the darkest moments in human history. So let's get right into it. You have to imagine the world right after the war. This was the question that was just hanging over everyone. How did this happen? The horror of the Holocaust, the scale of it. It couldn't have just been a few evil people. So social scientists were scrambling for an answer, for some kind of theory that could stop it from ever happening again. And in that search for answers, one theory came along that was, well, it was incredibly seductive because it seemed so simple. It offered a clear, straightforward explanation for an unbelievably complex horror. So in 1950, these researchers published a book called The Authoritarian Personality, and their big idea was this. Maybe the rise of Nazism wasn't a political or economic accident. Maybe it was a result of a specific, identifiable type of person. And this was their core idea, the authoritarian personality. The theory basically says that some people are just wired to be drawn to fascist ideas. They need rigid rules, they worship authority figures, and they take out their own aggressions on people they see as weaker or as outsiders. It's a very neat, tidy psychological box to put a fascist supporter in, right? So how did they even come up with this? Was there real science behind it? Well, the scientific look of the theory was a huge reason it got so popular. Let's dig into how they built it. They basically mapped out this psychological domino effect. They argued that it all starts in childhood. If you have a super strict, punishing, emotionally cold upbringing, well, as a kid, you can't really express your anger and fear towards your powerful parents. So all that bottled up hostility has to go somewhere. It gets displaced onto easier, weaker targets. And that creates an adult who, on the one hand, bows down to authority, and on the other hand, bullies everyone below them. And this quote just sums up their whole argument perfectly. See, in their view, the problem wasn't politics or economics. Not really. The root cause was psychology. It was about how you were raised. Fascists, they argued, are made right in the family home. And you know what? People absolutely ate this theory up. And it's easy to see why. First off, it's pretty comforting, morally speaking. It lets people in other countries point and say, see, they are different from us. Their psychology is broken. Second, it looked super scientific because it was based on this questionnaire they developed called the F scale, F for fascism. And finally, it just fit the political mood of the Cold War, allowing people to lump all forms of totalitarianism together. But like a lot of theories that seem a little too neat, a little too perfect, this one started to show some major cracks. And the problems really started with its basic methods. The biggest problem, the absolute heart of the issue, was that F scale, that scientific tool they used to measure everything. Turns out it wasn't so scientific or objective after all. It had a huge flaw baked right into its design. And here's where it all falls apart. The questions on the F scale were basically rigged. If you agree to statements about tradition or discipline or obedience, you'd score high on fascism. It was fantastic at finding right-wing authoritarians, but it was completely blind to the possibility of left-wing authoritarianism. The tool itself was politically biased from the get-go. This whole bias thing, though, it points to a much deeper, more fundamental problem with the theory, one that completely flips the script on cause and effect. Okay, so just to recap, Adorno's theory claimed your personality is pretty much set in childhood. You have an authoritarian personality, and that causes you to seek out and adopt a fascist ideology later in life. Personality first, ideology second. Well, modern psychology suggests it's the complete opposite. It's not about who you are deep down. It's about the situation you find yourself in. More specifically, it's about feeling threatened. That's what pushes people towards authoritarian ideas. So what kind of situations are we talking about? Well, think about it. When there's a huge economic crisis, a major terror attack, or society is just changing way too fast, people get scared. And when people feel threatened and unsafe, even folks who are normally pretty tolerant can start to crave a strong leader, law and order, and policies that punish outsiders. The situation becomes the real engine driving these beliefs, not some pre-existing personality. So you might be thinking, okay, if the theory was biased and got the cause and effect totally wrong, should we just throw it in the trash? Well, not so fast. It's a bit more complicated than that. We have to separate the flaws from the warning. Let's break down its legacy. On the one hand, the sins were huge. It basically blamed individual people instead of the political and economic systems that failed. It gave other countries a false sense of security. But on the other hand, you have to give it some credit. It had merits. It was one of the first big studies to really zero in on the psychology of obedience, and it paved the way for a ton of important research that came later.
But if you had to pick the single biggest sin of this theory, it's this. It took a massive, structural, historical disaster, and it shrank it down to a problem of individual psychology. It focused on broken people, and in doing so, distracted everyone from the broken systems, the economic collapse, the national humiliation, the propaganda, that actually created the crisis.
And that brings us to the final, really powerful takeaway here. The authoritarian personality theory itself, scientifically, it was wrong about the cause. But the warning it carried about the dangers of blind obedience and fear-based aggression, that was absolutely profoundly right. And the most chilling lesson of all isn't that some people are just born to be fascists. It's that under the right conditions of threat and uncertainty, the potential for authoritarianism isn't just in them, it's in the situation. And that means it could be in any of us.